The first raven came before dawn, a fleck of darkness against the gray over Winterfell's godswood, and would not be coaxed from the weirwood's bone-white arms. Jon found it there in the pre-dawn stillness, its beak tapping soft as a knuckle against the red-veined bark, its eyes slick as oil. The breath of the old tree filled the air like snow smell, like something colder and older than breath. He stood beneath the faces, and ghosts slid like mist between the roots, his white coat the last of the night lingering on the ground. The raven would not come to his hand. Its leg bore no ribbon, no wax, no scrap of skin with skittering script. Yet when it fixed him with that bead of black, Jon felt a heaviness gather behind his eyes, and something like the sway of the wall beneath his feet, and a roar, a color he had no name for because it weren't the blue of winter or the red of blood. Green, he told himself later, yet it was not heraldic green or the green of moss on a stone. It was the green of madness catching, of a tide that burned. "Old gods," he said, and the bark took his words and made them very small. The raven clicked its beak, and in his remembered voice Grand Maester Aemon said, "There are fires that will not be quenched by water." And in the same breath another voice, Bran's, soft and far, part boy and part something else, said, "King's Landing." The air sharpened. Jon raised his hands as if to soothe the bird that did not need soothing. The green swell he had felt in the space behind his eyes unfurled into a vision. There, then gone, yet it left him hollowed, like the old tree with its faces cut. A city of red roofs and crowded alleys, a sept that rose like a marriage of stone and prayer, and beneath it all, jars by the thousand with chains like veins, and a spark crawling as a patient worm crawls under a bandage. His hand found the weirwood palm to pale bark. The heart tree's sap smelled like earth turned with a spade after winter. "Bran," Jon said, and his voice clouded in the cold. "How sure?" There was no answer. The raven flared its wings, a crack of black on white, and sprang into the brightening gray and was gone. Behind him, the godswood muttered with thin ice cracking on the pool. The castle was waking. A distant ring of hammer on nail, a cough of a stable boy, the murmur of women at their morning fire. Ghost looked up, yellow eyes reflecting the faint red of the carved faces. Jon rested his forehead against the tree for a heartbeat. Then he turned and went. He found Sansa in the hall, talking low with Lyanna Mormont. They stood in a wash of weak winter light, with the banners of dead Starks and living ones hanging motionless above them. They fell silent as he came near. Sansa's hair, rich as chestnut with a thread of iron, fell thick down one shoulder. The girl Lyanna had the eyes of a hawk and the bluntness of someone who has always lived with cold. "What is it?" Sansa asked and looked towards the doors, for a moment expecting horsemen with ill news. Jon told them what he had seen, the way he had learned to tell hard truths, plain and without adornment. Sansa listened without scoffing, as one who had learned that the world was ill-made for simple disbelief. Lyanna did not blink, as if to affirm that a boy who'd fought dead things could hear a warning from a bird. "Wildfire," Sansa said, tasting the word like poison on her tongue. "Cersei, the Alchemists' Guild still hoards the old king's jars," said a voice at the edge of the hall. Davos Seaworth walked in with the snow crusted on his beard like sea salt. He bowed his head a fraction to Sansa, a little deeper to Jon. "If there's a hell in this world, Lord, it burns green." Jon met his eye, seeing the ghosts sail there. Suns lost at Blackwater, oars charred, the river lit by a sea that shouldn't burn. Davos had told him once, by a low fire behind shut doors, what green fire does to skin and screams. "When?" Jon asked. "When will they burn it?" Davos shook his head. "I can't tell you that." His eyes flicked to the godswood door, as if Bran might come out of it with an answer. "But the woman will not wait for law if law won't bend to her. The High Sparrows got half the city in a noose of scripture. The Tyrell girl, the boy king, all of them in play. I'll wager Cersei has a knife none of them know to look for." Sansa's fingers tightened around the back of a chair. "If she means to burn the sept, she means to burn everyone in it. Marjorie, Loras, Tommen. If Bran showed you the city, Then there's time to do more than wring hands. Lyanna was small and fierce as a hawk in winter. Do we ride? John looked up at the banners hanging high. The dire wolf on gray, the old wool faded by smoke and time. The sight tugged at memory. Old Nan's tales, cold evenings when he was small, and believed a story could keep out the wind. Kings of winter riding to shut the sea with a word. Banners that turned storms aside. Laughable wishes to a boy or a man hardened by the wall. Yet the old gods didn't laugh. There are banners in the crypts, he said, and heard the oddness of it as soon as he'd spoken. Not the ones we fly for war. Older. There was a story once. Brandon Snow hung them round a holdfast, and no torch would hold flame within the circle. Nan said it was because the cloth was woven with heart tree fiber, and the poles cut from winter-hardened ash with runes carved in their grain. You remember it? He asked Sansa, and she nodded. Riddles and tales, Davos said softly, neither scornful nor believing. But the wall is a tale, and I saw you brought back from a pyre, M-Lord. Those banners were for winter, Lyanna said, chin tilted. This is wildfire. Fire is fire. Jon's mouth was dry. He thought of Melisandre's red eyes, the way she watched flames. He thought of Bran's voice without a mouth. I mean to try. You mean to sail, Davos said, as if it were decided. White Harbor has galleys that can run faster than any horse. We take a handful, not an army, or we'll be choking in the Reach and the Crownlands for want of grain before we ever see the city. If the gods, old or new, are with you, the banners will do what you say. In Winterfell's kitchens, the cooks cursed when told to pack salt beef and oats and apples that would keep. Lyanna Mormont demanded a place beside Jon and was told she would command Bear Island's levies from home. A decree she accepted like a slight to be remembered and forgiven later. Sansa went with Jon to the crypts, down into the echoing chill where the old kings kept stone watch. The air smelled of earth and forgetting. They walked past Lord Rickard and Brandon and Lyanna, spun flurries of dust stirring around their boots, until they found the chest that old Nan had whispered of. It was unimpressive even then. A plain oak coffer bound by iron, with little to say it had slept 100 years in the breath of the dead. The lock was the delicate work of a time when men had patience for small things. Jon knelt, and Ghost's breath steamed above the lid. The iron resisted him, then grudgingly gave with a grind like an old man's knee. Inside were 7 rolls of cloth bound around 7 ash staves. The cloth had gone dull, less gray than bone. Yet when Sansa brushed the weave with her fingers, she hissed softly. It stings, she said, surprised. Faint cuts ran across her fingertips where the weave had worried at her skin. Heart tree thread, Jon said. He didn't know how he knew. He knew only that the sight and smell of it, the faintest hint of sap and cold, filled him with the same certainty the wall had always granted, that some things held. He lifted one of the staves and saw the runes cut under soot and age. Short, stark strokes like half-remembered names, like the way the wind wrote across snow. The weirwood had faces. These were the tree's words. He tied the cloth back carefully. 7, he said. 7 gates. He remembered names as if Winterfell stones whispered them. Gate of the Gods, Lion Gate, Dragon Gate, River Gate, King's Gate, Iron Gate, Old Gate, Mud Gate on the river. 8, but one would have to do double duty. No matter, he murmured. We'll make do. Sansa pressed her chilled palm to Lyanna Stark's stone hand for a moment and pulled a breath that was not a sob. Not quite. Promise me, she said, and she did not say whence the words came. Jon put his free hand over hers, and the cold went through both of them to the stone and into the ground, as if his bones could feel how deep the north went. I will bring them home, he said. He did not know whose names he'd spoken. They made White Harbor at dusk, the sky stained like watered wine. Wyman Manderley's man opened the keys to Jon without sweetness, without resistance. The lord too big to leave his chair sent a fast galley with a dozen men who feared neither winter nor whales. Davos picked the boat with the neatest rigging and a captain whose eyes showed the right mix of pride and caution. You brought the city's savior to me once, the man said to Davos and spat to one side. Or the man some called king. It did not end well for him at Blackwater. He looked to John and shrugged. Perhaps your luck's better. We'll not bring a fleet, Davos told John as the lanterns in the quay winked out one by one. 2 ships. One for decoy if the gold cloaks decide we're smugglers. One to run if the first goes to the bottom. Men you trust and men who can keep their mouths shut. You don't have to come, John told him. Don't be daft, Davos said. If there's wildfire in it, I'll be there to spit on it. They left with the tide and the dark. The north slipped away, became a line of black on the blacker water, then no more than a memory of cold. Ghost prowled restless on the deck the first night, then found a place by John's feet and made of himself a rug that breathed. The sea was a heavy blanket, old and indifferent. 2 days the wind died and they slid like a knife through silk, the surface smooth as oil, and every word sounded too loud because the ocean was silent. On the 3rd day, a weather-thick haze rose ahead like a shore that wasn't a shore, and at sunset they saw the low glow of a million fires, as if a city had decided to be a star. Blackwater Bay was a scar with water in it. Davos stood at the prow, one hand on the forestay, and showed John where the great boom had stretched across the river, how the chain had trapped Stannis' ships, how the first jar had turned river to flame. There were still charred ribs of hulks at the edge of the channel, stuck in the mud like teeth. The smell in the air was tar and brine and the faintest hint of something sour that made John's tongue ache. Keep to the shadow of the bluff, Davos told the captain. The mud gate inspectors are lazy, but the Red Keep's lookouts are not. They moved into the city's throat with the tide. The wind shifted and brought the smells of kings landing on its back. Hot bread and human waste, dung smoke and roasted meat and cheap wine and the sweat of tens of thousands. The city's 3 hills rose as if the earth had been tugged up by giant hands, each hill stubbled with roofs and towers. The Red Keep watched from Aegon's high hill, arrogant and bright. The great September crowned Visenya's hill with pale domes and spires like a prayer half-answered. Rhaenys' hill showed the mounded ruin of the dragon pit like an old skull tucked into a fold of flesh. No one stopped them at the mud gate. The dockmaster's clerk was asleep in a shack and the night guard had gambled themselves blind. They tied up between 2 cogs with worn decks and no captain aboard. Davos moved with the green, remembering his bones had learned. He walked like a man who might still need to throw himself to the timbers when the sky caught fire. He guided John through the alleys that stink and the ones that only smelled lived in. They moved in shadows that had been there before the Targaryens and would outlast the Lannisters. The banners lay wrapped and silent in a sailcloth bundle at Jon's back. The wood of the staves, worn smooth by hands that had not touched them for a century, tapped lightly with their steps. The bundle had a weight, and not only because of wood and cloth. Jon felt it like a hand at his shoulder. Forward, forward, hurry. They slept 2 hours in a stable loft and woke with straw in their hair and the itch of city dust in their throats. In the belly of the city, the air was warmer than a northern summer. Melisandre's presence found them near dawn, a red like a heartbeat at the end of a passage. She walked without sound, and men looked away from her and tried not to. Only Ghost watched her with the still patience he gave to Elk at the Treeline. The Boy King's mother means to burn more than a temple, Melisandre said. Her voice had never shed its accent, thick and sweet and dangerous as syrup. She means to burn a city into obedience. It is a poor prayer to a false god, but the fire is real. Her red eyes flicked to the bundle on Jon's back. You bring ice into a place that has forgotten what cold is. Can you stop it? Davos asked. The old loathing in his voice was a scar. Melisandre looked at him as if he were smoke she did not want in her chambers. I am not the servant of crude alchemies, she said. Wildfire is a mockery, not a revelation. But there is a breath in it, a stolen wind. The banners have another breath. They could smother the one the pyromancers coaxed loose. You'll help then, Jon said, her mouth bent like a blade. If only for the sake of your struggle against the night to come, she said, and perhaps that was truth. Their first errand was not to the Sept or the Red Keep, but down into the city's bowels. Davos steered them through the street of flour, where dawn loaves steamed and bakers' boys darted and cursed. They ducked into the street of steel and came out on the river road where wine merchants and fishwives set up for the day. John listened to the dull music of 1,000 lives. The city was a creature that fed on itself and spat out things nobody wanted to look at. It was also a collection of hands that sewed and stirred and cured and kept breathing in spite of kings. He talked to 2 men whose boots were too clean, and a boy whose hands were too dirty to be a baker, and the old woman who remembered every cart that had rattled down that lane since Robert had been fat and happy and alive. The rumor about the Queen's men moving at night under the sept was a thin trickle. The rumor about the Alchemists' Guild being busy again was thicker. The rumor about a smell in the cellars beneath the Great September, one that turned your tongue to glass, was not a rumor. Those who had gone down and come up again were not eager to return. "You can't just walk to the gates and plant your wolves," Davos said as the sun cleared the smoke. "You hang strange cloth on the walls and the gold cloaks will have you in chains or your head on a spike. We do it when the city blinks." "We'll need help," John said. He thought of the sept, of the bells of Baylor that could cloak 100 footfalls in one peal. He looked up the hill toward the steps where the small folk knelt for blessings. "The High Sparrow is a zealot, but he claims to love the poor. If Cersei means to burn them, even he will listen." "You'll not find him simple," Davos warned. "He eats men like us for his breakfast and calls it fasting." The High Sparrow received them in a cold room with bare boards and the smell of candle smoke. He sat on a 3-legged stool in plain wool with one knee showing through at the seam. His beard was the color of rainwater, and his eyes were a clear, disappointment blue that made men feel grubby. He looked at John without the curl that most Southerners wore when confronted with the North. He looked down at Ghost, who lay with one paw on John's boot, and did not flinch. "Son," he said. John felt both younger and older at the same time. "The Queen means to burn your sept," he said, because there was no way to step into that cold room without stepping into honesty. "She means to burn the people in it. I have a way to keep your people from burning. I need to set these," he touched the bundle at his back, "on the walls." The High Sparrow did not flick his eyes toward Davos or Melisandre, or the silent men who had followed them, chosen for loyalty rather than glory. He watched John as if he were a sermon given by a man who did not know he was preaching. "The Queen is vain and wicked," he said, "and the boy who calls himself king is weak, but God's justice does not need strange northern sorceries. We have faith." "Faith is not stone," Davos said roughly. "I've seen what Wildfire does to it." Melisandre did not waste words on a man who would spit them out. She only watched his face and held her silence like a knife. "And what do you bring us, bastard of the North?" the High Sparrow asked, not to wound, but because titles mattered, because the way a man called you named what he believed you to be. John thought of his father's head on a spike, of the wall of steel in the cold. "I bring a circle that fire will not cross," he said. "If I'm wrong, I will be ash with all of you. If I'm right, your city breathes tomorrow." The sparrow stared at the floorboards a long time, then nodded as if he'd heard an argument he could not look pious and deny. "You do not bring your men into the sept," he said. "You do not bring that red woman onto God's floor." Melisandre's mouth tilted again, but she kept the rest of her face still. "Done," John said. He left with Davos and the men bearing the bundle, and they climbed. The city's gates were teeth around a mouth. Each was its own world. The Gate of the Gods with its carvings of 7-faced saints, the Lion Gate ringing with the clatter of carts from the Lannister warehouse roads, the River Gate damp with a perpetual breath from the muddy way, the King's Gate where the line for the day's meat ration had already begun, the Dragon Gate, the Iron Gate, the Old Gate, stone names with lives pinned to them. At each, John spoke to the sergeant on duty in the language that men understand when they have learned to weigh steel against meat. The talk of coin, the talk of threat, the talk of something happening that you don't understand and want no part of. "And you'll hang what on my watch?" one sergeant with a farmer's hands demanded, trying not to look too long at Ghost. "An old banner," John said. "You'll call it superstition and laugh at me when I leave." "I will," the sergeant agreed, and signed the paper that said he'd be laughing. They hung the first banner before noon at the Gate of the Gods. The pole went up like any well-made staff into the sockets where pennons had flown before. John's hand closed on the ash in a grip that knew it by birth. He felt the weight of carved lines in the wood. He slid the cloth free, and the dull gray unfurled into the air. Nothing happened, and then something did, but it was so small you could have missed it. A brief hush in the noise of the square, as if the city had drawn in a shallow breath and held it. The banner did not flutter, though there was a wind. The weave lay without rippling, as if it had been printed against the air. John smelled snow in a place where there was no snow. He felt the hush more strongly against his skin than in his ears. Melisandre's eyes narrowed. "Well," she said, almost to herself. At the river gate, Davos touched the cloth after John tied it off and jerked his hand back, surprised. "Cuts," he muttered, sucking his fingertip, "like little teeth in the thread." At the Lion Gate, a boy thrust his hand into the reach of the banner and winced and said, "Cold," and laughed because it was Summerco. LD in a winter city. By evening, the 7 were hanging. On the mud gate, John took the 7th pole and lashed it to the arm of a broken crane. There would be no 8th. He had miscounted names and gates. "This will do," he muttered. The old story did not speak of arithmetic. The air around him had become a thing he could almost touch. A taut skin pulled over a bowl, the bowl the size of a city. Dusk draped itself over the hills, and someone rang a bell on Visigna's hill. Not the high, bright call to prayer, but a test toll, a bored sexton deciding he could not abide silence any longer. The sound rolled over roofs and hammered quiet places. John felt the sound strike the hush and pass through it like a hand through fog. "It's not a wall," he said to himself. "It's deeper. It's a shroud," Melisandre said, behind him, her ears catching the same thing. "You have made a city into a grave that refuses to accept fire. That's a trick even my God admires." "Let's see if it holds when something hungry presses," Davos said. They did not sleep that night. In the low places of the city, men drank and sang. In the higher places they watched. Qyburn's little birds ran with feet soft as whispers. The wordless children passed coins and knives and small bits of death from hand to hand. In Maegor's holdfast, Cersei Lannister drank a wine the color of rubies with a smile that repeated the same unfunny joke until even her reflection had tired of it. She wore a dress that made her seem armored even out of plate. A new queen of the 7 had once laughed at her. Now Cersei's mouth had learned to laugh back without sound. "Will it be done?" she asked Qyburn, the man who had come to her without name and left with one she owned. He smiled without teeth. "It will be done, your grace," he said, and did not say, "unless it won't." He could smell strange cold when he stepped on the balcony. He did not believe in gods, only in endings. At dawn, the city woke to rumor that the trial would be in 2 days' time. The Faith's men moved like a wave, sweeping courtyards. The Tyrell men watched with the habitual boredom of soldiers waiting for orders to do something they did not understand and would not like. Marjorie Tyrell sent a folded note to her grandmother in the country that said only, "Tomorrow I will cough early." She kept another note in her sleeve that said, "The Queen is a fire with a mind." She had not decided to send it because she did not think anyone could help. Tommen Baratheon, small, soft, trying to be harder than his bed, knelt on his floor and prayed marks into his knees. He asked the 7 to make his mother gentle. He asked his mother to make God kind. He asked a world that had never listened to forgive him for asking. Jaime Lannister came at noon, his horse lathered from the last sprint into the city, the gold of his beard dulled by road dirt. He smelled the smoke and the war and the latrines and knew he was home. He found Cersei looking out at the sept and tried to remember when her face had last been a country he could cross without being bitten. "Why are the walls hung with northern cloth?" he asked, because it was the oddest thing he could name, because it was easier than the real question he had grown into. She smiled without humor. "Some peasant with a wolf sigil thinks wool will save his soul," she said. "The city is a nest of superstitions. You'll correct them, won't you, Jaime?" He kissed her cheek and tasted iron. Jon watched the city breathe. He walked the circle of the 7 gates again, and everywhere the hush lay like a lake under the noise. When he came to the Lion Gate at twilight, a woman with a baby at her breast stopped him and touched his sleeve. "It feels like when my mother put a wet cloth on my forehead when I burned," she said, embarrassed to be saying something that made no sense even to her. "Do you know what I mean?" "Yes," John said, because he had burned and been cooled, and because he understood the knowledge a poor woman could trust and would not betray it with mockery. She nodded, satisfied, and stepped aside. They took their posts before dawn the next day. Davos went to the river. Melisandre climbed to the edge of the great September steps and stood against the rail, her red silk looking like blood on marble. John took a position near the King's Gate, where he could see the Sept's windows catching the early light. Ghost moved at his side as if the noise of the city irritated him, as if he longed for the sound that snow makes. The bells began. They sounded like contrition, like need. The old men in rough wool and the women with baskets and the little ones with bare feet went toward the doors as they always had, because habit is stronger than kings. The Queen Mother did not appear. Marjorie Tyrell's mouth tasted like copper. She watched the floor and listened to something along the edge of her hearing, as if a thin strand of wire had been drawn through each column of the sept and made to sing. Lancel Lannister followed a boy with a scraped knee down a stair he did not know. He felt virtuous and then foolish and then frightened. In a cellar with a mouth like a wound, the air tasted of coins and the color green. He saw a line of candles and a slickness crawling along a channel like breath through a pipe, and he remembered sudden pain and older vows and something he had promised to do if he could ever be useful. He began to hurry and then to run and then fall. The pain in his leg was like a nail hammered up through bone. He crawled and wept and prayed, and the altar did not care. The green whispered to the cut in his thigh as if it were a lover. Qyburn's children watched from holes nobody had mapped. They did not see the banners or the hush. They saw only that the candles were burning down toward the slickness. One of them laughed because he had seen rats drown in pitch and liked it. Another put his finger between his teeth and bit because the cold had made him feel the way he had when his mother would hold him very tight and make him stop crying. Cersei was not in the September. She sat at a window with a cup as if the wine were an answer, and she a woman content to ask no more questions. The mountain stood behind her like a statue that had learned to breathe for the sake of frightening the living. The High Sparrow spoke. Marjorie leaned toward her brother, thin as a winter sapling, and said, "We must leave." The old man did not pause for her fear with his God's words. She was a girl in a dress in his universe. She took Loras by the hand and rose to go, and the faith's men barred her with politeness turned to iron. She felt the hum grow so strong it seemed to lift the hairs on her neck. She had seen the city in summer. She had tasted peaches. She knew a way out when one offered itself. She turned and went toward one of the side doors. Men tried to stop her. She smiled and used the smile that had taught enemies to yield because it was easier than wrestling with the woman she was. The door opened. The air on the step outside felt different. John felt it too. The hush pressed hard against his skin, harder than before, as if the banner had caught a gale that made no sound and must now hold. He looked toward the sept and saw a shadow move under it, a heat that was not heat, a kind of hunger without mouth. He thought of snow caves and of the sound of the wind above them trying to find a crack to ride into where men lay and tried to sleep. He thought of the cold that saved if you kept to its rules. He thought of his father's words. When you're not certain what's right, do not move. He did not move. The first jar went. There was no noise, not at first, not as the green bloomed under stone like a flower that had been prayed for too fervently. There was a wave of heat that would have blistered the skin off a man's face and a light that would have stripped the paint off a saint. The hush took it the way a hill takes wind, did not change, and so changed everything around it. The heat slid along the underside of the city's great skin and ran its fingers along the streets and found no crack to catch. It bunched like cloth pushed in one direction without finding a fold, gathered, and had nowhere to go. Melisandre's eyes were as wide as gems. "This is not my God's fire," she whispered, and put her palms flat against the stone rail. She pushed, not with arms, but with a will that had spent years learning to be a blade. The hush thickened. The green, finding only resistance above and unyielding rock below, went upward. It turned into a single pillar of plummeting jade, a spear that drove itself heavenward. The sept shuddered as if struck by something too vast to fit in any word man knew. Its windows blew outward in a rain of colored glass that chimed and chimed again as the shards fell and skipped along the steps. The doors flung wide like arms that had been crossed in prayer and were forced open. The bells sang out, and then they were silent. The pillar of green narrowed to a lance point and tore the sky. The hush held. In the canyon of the street below, men threw themselves flat, women screamed and then forgot to, children laughed because the green was pretty and not inside their bodies yet. A wave of air punched the breath out of lungs. John's hair lifted at the roots as if a hand had been thrust up through the stones and tried to comb him. Ghost flattened himself and snarled at something no one else could see. The banner above John's head snapped once and then lay still again, although the world was still moving. The fire came down again like a rain that wanted to be stone. The hush made a roof over the streets, and the rain hit the roof and spilled toward the courtyards, into the places where the stoneway turned and where the ragpickers lived. The green did not know how to be water. It was only fire made to act like what it was not. Cooled, tried to creep, licked at the lines of the square. Where it touched the air just under the banners, the cloth did not burn. Frost sprang there, brief and vanishing. A lace where the green set its tongue and found nothing to eat. Melisandre's face was wet. She did not know when she had begun to weep. Davos, on the river road, watched the tide push and pull green flecks like fish scales toward the mud gate and waited for one to catch on wood and turn the docks into a pyre. The flecks reached the boundary of the hush and went out as if pinched. He laughed, then clapped a hand over his mouth because the noise was unthinkable against a thing like that. In the Red Keep, windows burst, and a handmaiden bled to death from glass that gave her a new mouth at her throat. In the Sept, the High Sparrow held to his stool and recited prayers that no longer needed his voice. Marjorie stood on the step outside and watched a color climb the sky like a ladder, and half of her wanted to clap because of the sheer audacity of it, and half of her wanted to be sick. Tommen lost himself a moment and then found that he could breathe. He looked for his mother and did not see her, and for a moment he was only a boy, small and terrified. Jaime Lannister put his hand against a pillar and bowed his head. He had once killed a king to stop just such a thing. Now he had not been there to stop it, and only some northern magic, some accident with wool and ash poles, had saved the city that had not deserved saving. He thought of Cersei's wine and Cersei's dresses and Cersei's smile and felt something in him give like an old knot untying. In the belly of the city, Lancel Lannister lay with his head near a gutter in which the last of the heat crept forward to do its patient work. He stuck his arm across the channel as if his flesh were a gate and the green its river. He smelled frozen iron, and his hand went numb to the elbow. When he lifted it, his skin bore fine cuts in lines like runes. He laughed at that because he had never believed in the old gods, and now their language had written itself on him. He crawled toward the candles with a grunt for every pace and blew one out with a breath that took everything left in him. The others guttered and died without explanation. He passed out with his face on stone and did not die when the first breath of the green came to him, and then felt something that told it to turn aside. When the pillar of fire had finished trying to go to heaven and failed, it left a smear on the sky that looked like the arm of a giant girl who had drawn her finger through fog. The hush lightened. Jon took a breath that felt like someone had been sitting on his chest and just got up. The banner above his head trembled, then stilled. He felt the change in his bones. He did not look around for applause. The city made the sound cities make when they find they have not been killed. A roar and a crying, weeping and laughter, prayer and blasphemy, all at once. Somewhere a man sincerely promised to stop beating his wife if he was allowed to live until supper. Somewhere a thief decided to keep the coin he had cut from a rich man's purse because he could not bear waste when life had been so nearly wasted. Somewhere a girl looked at a boy and saw his face in a light that was not green and decided that she would let him kiss her after all. Habits resumed themselves like limbs remembered after numbness. Jon began to walk toward the sept. He did not have to fight a path. The The small folk did what small folk do around soldiers and men with purpose. They made way without believing they had made a decision. Melisandre joined him at the foot of the steps, her silk singed at the hem, a thread of ash on her cheek like a benediction given by a dirty hand. Davos came with his mouth set and his eyes bright with the memory of sons and of something like relief. Ghost's paws left clean prints in ash. The sept doors were hanging crooked. The marble floor beyond carried a dust that made the priests cough, and the glass from the windows had made 1,000 little rainbows that no one would ever quite sweep away. The High Sparrow sat on his stool, and for the first time Jon had seen him, he looked as if he was thinking about something beyond his god. Marjorie stood with her hands still at her sides, palms open, as if she had been prepared to hold her brother and had discovered she did not have to choose which of her 2 arms to use first. Jon stopped at the threshold. The Faith's men were torn between driving him out with their polearms and asking him to marry them to their sweethearts. Marjorie looked at Jon and saw an exhausted man with ash in his beard and a wolf beside him, and something in her, bred and trained and born, calculated how the world had tilted. She walked to him and dropped a little bow that was exactly enough to be gratitude and very much not obedience. "You have my thanks," she said. Her voice was steady, which was an art. "I did not do it alone," Jon said. "No one ever does," Marjorie replied, which was both truth and flattery. The High Sparrow lifted his head a fraction. "God has saved us," he said. "I would know what you have done so I can say if it was his will that worked through you, or will that needs punishing." "You are free to say what you like," Jon said, and heard a sharp intake of breath from Davos that said, "Careful. I am free to answer or not. What matters is this: your sept stands, and these people live." "And the Queen?" Davos asked, when neither piety nor politics answered. Cersei Lannister was not in the September. She stood in a room in the red keep with windows that did not break under the strange pressure. Qyburn came to her with his whisper voice and smelled faintly of smoke that had had its nature altered. "The Alchemist's Guild supply has been compromised," he said. He attempted a smile that died for lack of prey. "There is a force at work I do not understand." She threw the cup at him and did not watch where it went. "Jaime," she said without turning. She knew he had stood in the doorway for all the last minutes. "My enemies tried to take my son's crown." "Did they?" he asked softly. He had killed a king for a city. Now he was a man with one hand and a body that had learned to be a joke in a room where jokes killed. "Or did you try to take your revenge on a world that would not be ruled by you?" "You defend them," she said. He saw for a moment the girl she had been in Casterly Rock's galleries, looking at every stone and imagining herself a queen in waiting and not in truth. "I defend the living," he said, and his mouth tested the feeling of the words. He thought of the banners on the walls and the way the city had flinched like a dog and not burned. "I will not watch this city burn, Cersei." Later that day, when the smoke had learned to behave and the sun had turned the green smear to a less blasphemous color, Jon sat in a chamber offered him by a Tyrell captain of guards who had decided to back the man who could stop fire. He put his hands on his knees and looked at them. They were banded with cuts the thread had made, each line red and precise, as if a quill had taken notes upon his skin. Davos looked down at those hands and shook his head. "I never believed I'd be glad to smell King's Landing." "It will not hold forever," Melisandre said. She had taken a chair with a back to it, as if even she needed wood to lean against. "The cloth will fray, the rune's edges will blur under the air's little knives, and there is always another pot of fire, another trick." She turned her head to look at Jon. "You did what needed to be done today. Tomorrow will still need something." "Tomorrow always does," Jon said. He thought of Winterfell. He thought of Sansa's mouth when she tried to make a thing easier for him and could not. He thought of Bran, wherever he was, and wondered if the boy saw a green spear and smiled. There was no sleep for him that night. He walked the circle of the gates until his legs ached. The banners hung in the moonlight like strips of winter sky. The cloth had caught soot, but the soot did not cling as soot clings to wool. It flaked at a touch, and beneath the weave looked as it had in the crypt. At the river gate 2 boys daring each other to throw stones froze when he came near and then grinned, all teeth and bravado. "Ser Wolf," one said, and John laughed because he had never been anyone's Ser. He stopped at the gate of the gods and leaned against the cold stone. The air here smelled of tallow and prayer. A woman with a long scar on her cheek lit a candle and put it on a shelf where the rain had stopped for no reason 2 months ago, and she had decided it was a sign. John watched the little flame fight the faint draft and thought of fire and of the way men talk to it, because it is the first god any man ever learned to speak with. The city slept a different sleep. It was porous, as if a dark wave had rolled over it and left it wet beneath the skin. Ghost lay down and put his head on his paws and made that sigh that says a beast has recognized that nothing in the night can be fixed by running. Morning brought a council that was not called such because no one wanted to say they were making decisions. The High Sparrow came, his face more like a man's and less like a sermon, and Marjorie, who had not let go of her brother's hand since the green had gone up, and Jamie, who could not stop looking at the roof as if the sky might apologize. Lords came who had the coin to pretend they were not afraid. Qyburn did not come. Cersei sent a note that said only, "The crown will remember who took its side." Tommen came late, with a line around his eyes that would be a scar if he lived long enough. John stood when he entered. He remembered kneeling once to a king he'd thought honorable. He did not kneel now. He inclined his head the way a man greets a boy who has been forced into something before he molted his milk teeth. Tommen's mouth trembled and then did not. "Thank you," the boy said, little more than a whisper, as if he had been told never to use those words and had developed no habit for them. "The North remembers," John said quietly, "not just grudges." They spoke then of supplies, of walls, of men. They spoke of the fact that there were more jars beneath the city, under warehouses and forgotten chapels and the Red Keep itself. The Alchemists' Guild would not open their books. The faith could not stop men with keys. The crown had its own reasons for being blind when it suited it. There were too many places to dig and too little time. It was Marjorie who said, "If we cannot clean every cellar, we can clean the air." And she looked at John with the same frank calculation as when she'd bowed. "Can your cloth be made again?" John looked at Melisandre. She smiled, which looked more like a wincing. "You ask for the heart's breath of trees that will die for you to wear winter as a cloak," she said. "The North has trees, but it does not have time to grow what you would need at once." "We do what we can," John said. "We leave what we cannot. We make more banners from what we have. We teach the runes to men with careful hands." He thought of the street of steel, of quiet smiths, of apprentices with pliers and anvil scars. "We have Davos show the crown's men where the last ones burned. We tell the small folk where not to sleep. We make a map of the city's veins." Jamie tapped the hilt of his sword and looked at Tommen. "We burn the jars we find," he said. "With what?" Davos asked, a half-smile like the edge of bitterness. "Your mother's candles? We drown them in sand," said a Tyrell captain. "We pull them to daylight where they shame the men who keep them. We root out the guild." "You will not root out much," the High Sparrow said. "Men who make their living in darkness do so because the world rewards them for it. You can put a little fear in them. Fear has its uses." John rolled the old words in his mouth. He thought of his father saying, "The man who passes the sentence should swing the sword." He thought, "The man who lights the fire should be the one to stand by to see if it burns him." "Then light your house," he said, not to insult, but because he had learned that truth arrived faster if invited. "Proclaim that the faith will join its strength to the North's against the dead when they come." The High Sparrow looked at him as if he had asked a shepherd to lead his sheep into the water because a wolf might come. "The dead are your northern fancy," he said without contempt. "Let us tend to our poor in our poor way." John did not argue. He had not come for oaths he could not keep or extract. He had come because a boy with many names had sent him a sight, and a vision had saved a city. "We'll set men to each gate to watch the cloth. We'll find men with clean hands who can sew," he said instead. He turned to Marjorie. "I will send a raven to Winterfell to ask for more thread. We will do what we can, as I said." "You saved a city that once cheered when your father's head was raised," Jamie said, as if to himself. You'll forgive me if I find that remarkable." John looked at him, at the man who had once been young and beautiful and unscarred by honors kept too late. "My father taught me to keep people alive," he said. He did not draw a line at a city's gates. That afternoon, men with hammers and chisels began to pry at stones under cellars. They found jars, some broken and some not, some oozing a thick substance the color of an old leaf, and the smell of holidays rotten in the heat. They dragged them into daylight where the banner's hush cut their breath and watched the green go slack like a mind that had been drugged. They took them to a ditch outside the walls and buried them under sand and wet clay, and the ditch ran like a scar around the city after. Qyburn sent little boys with knives. They cut a reeve's rope at the lion gate and would have cut more if Ghost had not trotted into the alley without sound and taught them respect for White Fangs. One boy died in a puddle thinking he was playing. Qyburn watched the corpse come to his table and felt nothing and wondered if he ought, as if one could decide such things. Cersei stopped going to windows. Jaime did not stop. Marjorie walked among the people and told them to boil their water and not to light candles in the cellars. And her hands shook once where only one woman saw and held them without speaking. The High Sparrow knelt in the soot and told a child that God was merciful. The child nodded because he knew that mercy was a coin like any other men passed back and forth, even if you called it by another name. Melisandre stood in the dragon pit at dusk and let the red light throw a line on her cheek. The pit stank of old dragon bones, of dust and pride. She looked at the city and lifted her hands and said a prayer that had nothing to do with wildfire and everything to do with a different set of flames. Flames she hoped would eat a night even she did not want to look upon. She felt the hush around the city loosen at the edges like a bandage that had done most of its work and would come off in time. "Not enough," she said. "Never enough." She did not say for what. At sunset, Jon went to the sept alone, because he wanted to see it without the clamor. The pale stone had a wound on its face where a statue had been, and he wondered whose face had gone in pieces. Inside, the colored glass had made the floor a field of jewels. He looked up at the high dome and saw the place where heat had licked and failed. He did not feel triumphant or even righteous. He felt grateful to have been permitted to be correct once in a world that rarely handed out such mercy. He put his palm to a column, and the cool went through to his bones. A footstep came behind him, and he left his hand on the stone and did not reach for his sword. Jaime Lannister stood a little to one side, as if he had learned the courtesy of not blocking a man's view of the thing he had saved. The Kingslayer, they called him, and the name had been a wall in front of his face for years. Jon looked at him with a soldier's appraisal and a man's pity. Jaime looked at the direwolf stitched small on Jon's collar and thought of the lion stitched so loudly on his own life. "You could have let it burn," Jaime said, conversational as men get when they have nothing to say that won't cut something tender. "The city would have deserved it. It always has." Jon thought of flea-bottom children and bakers and smiths and fools and the way hats fall off men when they run, how their mouths look so stupid with fear, and how much he loved them for the stupidity that marked them as living. "No," he said. Jaime nodded. "No," he agreed, and it surprised both of them. He looked up at the dome and his jaw worked. "You did what I once did. You saved them, and they will call you a criminal for it if it pleases them. They will never know they were saved. They will call it God's will or their own good sense. They will go on eating and pissing and betraying each other and making jokes they shouldn't laugh at. That is what it means to save a city. I don't need them to know," Jon said, and believed it until he thought of Sansa's face when she would hear it, and of Lyanna Mormont pounding a small fist to a table and declaring that she had known he would. He felt a sudden savage tenderness for them both and for his dead father. "I need them to be alive." Jaime took a breath that shook. "The boy is learning to be king," he said. "Your banners? Will you leave them?" "As long as they hold," Jon said. "Then I take them home. This city will burn or it will not, but the north will freezes if we don't prepare." He closed his eyes a moment and saw a cold that wore no face and had no appetite but everything. "I asked them for men. We'll see." "You will get promises," Jaime said, and his mouth twisted in knowledge. "And a few good men who will die badly for your sake. And you will save the world with them or you will die trying." Either way, you will have done more than most of us." John left the sept and stood on the steps. The city's light had turned ordinary again. He looked across roofs at the places where the banners lay like shadows of a thing not present. The hush, barely there now except when a man leaned close and listened, was a reminder as soft as breath on the back of the neck. He might imagine it had been a fancy. He might blister his hands on rope and wood and know it was not. He smiled at a child who shoved his little brother and then laughed because he had not hurt him enough to make him truly sorry. The next day the court tried Loras Tyrell, and the faith forgave him his sins, and men judged whether humiliation was better than death. The boy king wore a crown that had begun to feel heavy to him. Marjorie turned her face so the light caught it and made a rumor of courage to feed to a hungry city. Cersei did not come. Qyburn prepared a speech he would never give. Jaime stood near a pillar and thought of snow he had never seen fall, only heard about from travelers who would not stop talking about it. The banners hung. No green fire came. News goes out of a city like rats. Ravens lifted from rooftops and flew north with words that had not been put into sentences yet. One found Winterfell. Sansa took it with hands that had been touched by strange cloth and cut without bleeding. She read and looked across the yard the way you look with a thought that travels faster than horses. Lyanna Mormont stood with her and smirked because she had known that the wolf would do something mad and right. In time, Jon would take down the banners and carry them back with the care one gives to the bones of saints. He would find that you could not make new ones quickly. The heart trees submit to no man's hurry. He would send to the crannogmen for thread, and to halls where women spun by low lamps with bare fingers that hurt and swelled and did not complain for pain because they were accustomed to worse. He would teach a smith in the street of steel how to copy the runes with tools soft as kisses and hard as debt. And the man would do it because he was a craftsman, and the world is saved by craftsmen more often than by heroes. The city did not burn that day. The jars under the Red Keep and the Great September sat like a scorpion under a man's bed, biding. The alchemists' guild sulked in their den and tried to conjure a way around a hush they could not dispel. The High Sparrow preached a sermon that credited God and did not mention wolves. Davos drank very little and still found himself a little drunk because memory had its liquor. Melisandre looked into a brazier's coals and saw a boy on a field of snow and a man pulling a girl from a pit of bones and a woman with a crown of ice and all the fire in the world and none of it enough. She told no one and went to bed before the moon rose. Jaime sat with his sister and did not touch her and did not find a word that would fix anything. Tommen lay awake and thought of the way the light had looked and wondered if this was what miracles felt like. A quiet afterward and a day to go to after. Marjorie placed a flower on a sill where ash still clung and smiled for a girl who watched her with eyes big enough to drink the world. Jon crouched beside Ghost in a borrowed room and scratched the soft place behind the direwolf's ear and felt, for the first time in months, the way sleep approaches when it is persuaded that a man has done enough for one day. When he slept, the old gods took him. He stood in a wood that was not Winterfell's, though it had a weirwood in it. The tree had faces old and recent cut into its bark, and its sap glistened in a wound like a tear. Bran stood on the other side of the pool and raised his hand. He was a boy and a man and something else beside. He wore a look like a storm sitting on a mountain, deciding which valley to wash away. "You did well," Bran said, and the words came from the leaves, not his mouth. "It is not enough." "It never is," Jon said, and felt neither anger nor despair, only a weary acceptance of physics. The way burdens accumulate and roll if you don't put your shoulder into them. "Tell me." Bran's eyes went white. The wind lifted, and the rushes by the pool made their thin applause. Jon saw too much. A wall of ice shattering, a blue light in a forest, fingers touching stone where there should be no hand at all. He saw a dragon's shadow on a city that did not yet exist. He saw snow piled against the Great September steps and heard bells choked into silence not by green but by white. He saw a circle of banners hanging in a dark that swallowed breath and gave none back. He woke with his heart like a fist and put his hand to his chest to push it down. Ghost lifted his head and whined a question. Jon rubbed his ear again. He had learned to accept two truths at once, that a man might be given a day when he had saved a city and ought to be allowed to feel it, that the number of such days would never be enough to blunt the edge of the ones that were coming. At dawn he wrote to Sansa and told her nothing about visions and everything about cloth. He asked for thread spun from the heart weir and for ash staves cured in winter wind. He asked for women's hands and men's patience, and for boys to carry the things that men made to where men would need them. He asked for Wyman Manderley's ships to carry sacks that weren't grain, and for the ports to keep their mouths shut as if silence were bread. He walked the gates again, as if by measuring them with his feet he could measure the work that had been done. The banners hung. On the wind they did not move, but a sparrow lit on the edge of one and fluffed and sat and did not die. Jon watched it, and for the first time laughed like a man with his lungs fully opened. He thought of the woman with the baby who had called cold a kindness. He thought of all the ways men used fire and then pretended it had used them. When he went to the Red Keep, he was not invited, but he was not forbidden. Jaime met him in a gallery with windows that had survived. He leaned against the stone, the weariness of a man who had stood on either side of too many thresholds, and said, "If you ask for men, you will get fewer than you need." "I know," Jon said. "You will get Ser Adam Marbrand, if I can manage it," Jaime said. "He knows how to light a fire that a camp will not despise, and how to put one out if it tries to eat the wild." He paused. "You will not get the Queen Mother, and that will matter." Jon nodded. "Say to her that if she wants her son to have a realm to sit a throne over, she will send me ships and salt pork and men who can learn to swing a sword before the spring." He smiled without mirth. "Say it however you say such things in this place." "I'll say it," Jaime said, "and I'll be told to lick a boot for my trouble." "Do not," Jon said. Jaime laughed. "Believe me, I have licked worse." Jon left him with the weight of his own words. At the king's gate a boy had drawn a dire wolf on the stone with a bit of coal. The ears were crooked. The mouth bared too many teeth. It looked more like a pig with a grudge than any wolf. Jon stood and looked and did not correct it. He set his palm against the cloth and thought he felt the tiniest answering pressure, like the memory of his father's hand at his shoulder in a crowd. He stayed 3 more days, long enough to see the city forget a little and remember what it had been meaning to do before it almost died. Long enough to see the banners ignored and then half glorified and then declared luck charms by men who never believed in anything but the weight of silver. Long enough to see the High Sparrow frown at a girl who laughed at the wrong time and to think that the city had only been saved from one kind of burn to be singed by another. He sat with Marjorie once and found her kind and cold and very alive. He was glad she lived, not because she was good but because living people are easier to persuade than dead ones. When he left, he took Davos and Melisandre and a handful of men whose loyalty was not for sale, and he left the banners hanging with instructions for men at each gate, men chosen for thick fingers and patience and a willingness to sit still. He walked to the mud gate in the dawn. The river smelled like tar and work. The galley waited. Ghost leaped aboard as if he had been born on planks. Marjorie came to the quay without announcement. Jaime was there by accident because he had come to look at water and imagine it dousing fires. The High Sparrow did not come. That would have been too much like an admission that the world had not been made by rules he understood. Tommen sent a guard with a letter promising grain and men, which was either a promise or a folded hope. "You will write when you need more thread," Marjorie said, and put a hand on the rail as if the boat were a stubborn child. "We have women who can spin," she added, and the edge of irony was gentler than it could have been. "We have always spun from what the world gives us." "Thank you," Jon said. He meant it. Jaime nodded to him in the way soldiers do that, is almost a salute and almost a shrug. "If you find yourself dying in a snowstorm, don't," he said, which was the best advice anyone had ever given Jon and he had never been able to keep. Davos spat into the river for luck. Melisandre watched the wake as if it told her what fire would ask of them next. The city receded. Jon stood at the stern until the domes of the sept became the size of a thumb and then nothing at all. He saw the smoke not rising and then he saw only water and sky. On the deck he unrolled one of the spare scraps of cloth that Sansa had cut from the banner's edges and sent with him, a threadbare trifle with the weave's small teeth still sharp. He held it to his face and inhaled. It smelled like the gods would at night and like snow falling in windless air. It reminded him that the North was a country that would be asked soon for more than cloth. He turned from the rail and looked down the length of the ship at men who had believed a wild tale and watched it prove itself true. He thought of the work waiting at Winterfell, of ravens to send, of maps to draw with little pins where men would die to make a larger circle that fire could not cross. He thought of the banners hanging in a city he did not love, protecting people who would not thank him. He thought of his father. He thought of the wall and the dead and the way the green had gone up and not out. He thought of winter, and for the first time in days the word felt like an ally rather than a sentence. He set his hand on Ghost's neck and the wolf leaned into it and made a pleased sound, and the ship took them north into the wind that smelled like nothing but itself. The raven that had sat in the weirwood took flight from Winterfell at almost the same moment, black on black against the morning. It flew over leagues of field and brown river, over villages where men still made bread and women still made babies and the old kept the old stories smoking in their mouths. It flew and did not tire. It went to a place where a boy was learning to be a tree and a man was learning to be legend and a world was trying not to be a grave. And even as it flew, in King's Landing 7 strips of gray hung without moving and kept the air cool where it needed cooling, until such time as breath was needed for a different kind of fire.